Okay, welcome to our second section of the Living with God class. When I did this the first time, I did it when I was a parish pastor back in Michigan. And this may not be the right way to say it, but I didn't know as much then as I do now. And so what I did, and these notes are, the early notes that I have are back from that time period. But what I did there, and what I think is a much healthier way to do Bible study, is I took an hour and I went through whatever the material was. So what I didn't get done in 2 hours last week, I just hit the highlights and did it in an hour. And then we took a break, and then I had people getting together in small groups. I still like the concept of it. And there are questions that you will see at the end of every one of the sheets that from the handouts, and I would have people in groups of maybe 4 or 5 get together and talk about certain questions. They could pick whichever one they wanted, and then we would get back at the end and we would kind of process those. I don't know how many people have said to me, I don't like going to Bible class or Bible study because everybody has their own idea. I think this, I think this, I think this is what's right. And then when you get all done, you all go home and say, what's right?
That's right.
And rather than saying, maybe somebody can kind of bring it together, that's really the concept of how the Lifelight was put together. The Lifelight Bible Studies at Concordia Publishing House did. And I have about 150 little videos that Kathy would turn on the machine for me down in the basement, most of them. So those are on Emmaus's website as well. There are 13 groups of 9 sessions, minus a couple where something happened. They're gone. I don't know where they are. They went into the cloud and never came back out to the sun again. But I would do a little summary session, so I would not sit in with the people, and I did those while I was over at Bethlehem on the east side in St. Paul. But I would do a kind of a little summary. So I would just have, right under the camera, I would just have an outline that I could read even without my glasses on, and just kind of talk through the texts. So Genesis and Exodus are both in that, and then many of the New Testament books are in there as well. And so what happened then is we would get back together and we'd talk about it. And people said, I quit going to Bible class because I don't know if what they're saying is correct. And so to me there is a help, and it's why the church says that we're going to train people who are going to do further study to help us make some sense of it and not go off in as many different weird directions that might end us up in kind of funny places. So anyway, that's the way that was put together, and I'll have a few more comments in the future about some of how that went. A couple of things that I wanted just kind of highlight at the beginning. And so my problem is always I like to take a long time and think about something, and then at the end I got to run like mad to finish it. But we will get through the Abraham story today, and probably Isaac, and maybe a little bit into Jacob. I'm not expecting to go all the way through chapter 36 today, but we should catch up by the end of next week with the Genesis story. So here's a question for you. Are people basically good?
No. You have to learn to be good.
You have to learn to be good. Learn to be good. You all agree with that?
I think by nature we aren't good.
By nature we're not good. Okay. I think I've mentioned to you, or you might know from other places, that Kathy was a preschool teacher. And the first week was always a very, very interesting week. The first day of class, she had to teach the kids how to kick each other in the head when they were doing something on the floor. The next day, she had to teach them how to spill their milk on somebody else all over the floor. The third day, usually, and I didn't start till Tuesday, the third day she'd have to teach them how to kick each other down the steps and slam each other's hands in the locker. And the final day, she needed to teach them how to make excuses. Right? You spend all of your time trying to teach them not to. Not to. Who says people are basically good? people who want nothing to do with God. Then, if somebody is bad, we can come up with any other answer possible. When I was teaching evening college at Concordia, there was one night when we were doing the Proverbs, and we did 6 nights. The Torah, which is what we're doing here in 10 weeks, we would do in 4 hours. Then the prophets, the writings, the Gospels, the epistles, and church history. So the third night, when we're talking about Proverbs, among other things, I said, let's put on the board all the reasons why bad things happen to people. And it didn't always happen this way, but in that particular class, it was on Concordia's campus, the 43rd item was, it's my fault. The 43rd item. All of the reasons why bad things happen, but not to get anywhere close to, maybe I'm the reason this happened. Now, part of what we're doing in this course is looking at God's side of the story about what human nature is. And how does God deal with people who are not what he made them to be? That's pretty much what we talked about last week. Do we have free will? We do not. So, who told me what I was going to have for breakfast this morning? No, you didn't. You asked me what I wanted. I said eggs would be great, and I got eggs and potatoes and toast.
Oh, wow. Coming to
Okay.
your house.
Huh?
I'm coming to your house.
It's all right. We won't be there. Just let us know when. We'll make sure we're elsewhere. You make wonderful breakfast, so I can't say that. But I could have had Cheerios. I could have had shredded wheat. I could have just had a piece of toast. I could have just had coffee, right? I could have chosen a lot of different ways to get here today. I didn't have to go the way I went. We came up 35 and got off at Lexington and came north, but I could have come all the way up Lexington, or I could have gone over to 65 and then come back here. So there's a lot of things where I can have what we call free choice. Free choice. Free will, technically, now again, we work with definitions. Free will would be that I can will to do something and I can accomplish it and no one will stop me. Now people say, well, nobody can do that. Well, God can. He can create things any way he wants. There is no one who's going to tell God, sorry, I don't like it, you better try this one again. God can do what he will. We have a prayer even, I don't know if you've ever heard of something called the Lord's Prayer. It says, thy will be done. So our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. My will be done on earth, do what you want in heaven. Well, I said, well, how many of you in class one day, it was the same class, in 2001. There was the same class in the fall as 9/11. But this one young lady, I said, how many of you have ever chosen your parents? She said, I did. She really believed she existed as some disembodied spirit up there, chose who her parents were going to be. And I said, and you can choose to live for 250 years, right? She said, well, no, I can't choose that. So there are limited ways in which we can have free will. But in terms of our relationship with God, well, did Adam and Eve have a choice? Did they have free will in the garden before the fall?
Must have, they chose the apple.
Remember, there was no apple mentioned in there. It was not the apple on the tree, it was the pear underneath that got us into trouble.
Yes, it was.
Just so you remember that one. It's free, so you know, if you pay nothing for it, you know, you have to take what you get.
Romans 11 says they didn't.
Pardon?
Romans 11 says they didn't.
They didn't what?
God has bound all men over to disobedience in order that he might have mercy on them.
Yeah, Romans 2 kind of, or Romans 1 kind of sounds like that too. here's the deal. Remember what Yogi Berra used to say, when you get to the fork in the road?
Take it.
Take it, right? Is that how Adam and Eve were created?
We were created to be in relationship with God.
Okay, they were in a relationship
Yes.
with God,
Yep.
so they could choose to stay in it or choose to leave, okay? I can choose to stay in the train or get off at a particular stop. Might not be the best stop. I might jump off the train while it's going 80 miles an hour too. But in other words, it's not like they were in neutral. This is going to be important for us all the way through to understand what human nature is about. They had the chance to stay in the relationship. God did not want them to know good and evil. He just wanted them to know good. He wanted them to know the relationship with Him, and we are in essence told salvation and eternity is getting back to that, where we are not at enmity with God. He says we're not at enmity with Him much earlier. Jesus is described in Romans 5 that while we were enemies, Christ died for us, and now there is no longer any enemy relationship, but an intimate relationship that we can have with God. But when we look at some of these concepts, we understand, why do people have different ideas about religion? The religion of the world says people are basically good and we have free will. Now, what happens after the fall, and Luther had a big discussion about this with Erasmus in 1526, where he said we don't have free will. And Erasmus said we did. Many Christians believe we have free will, and that we have to make the choice to be good for God, and that it is in our court. That God has given us salvation, but now He expects that He's kind of undone our paralysis instead of our eternal death, undone the paralysis. Now get back to doing the good works that God prepared beforehand for you to walk in them. And if you don't do enough of those, then you're going to have a price to pay one way or another. All right? Now, if we talk about original sin, and that's hinted at in the first part of Genesis 5, that Adam bore Seth in his own image and likeness instead of in the image of God. And we talked about that last week, that to be in the image of God means to have dominion. Not to be in charge of life, which is the tree of life, and not to be either with God or apart from Him. When they pulled away and broke the relationship, one of my favorite children's sermons was the vacuum cleaner. Okay, I'd put a vacuum cleaner up in church and be vacuuming a little bit, and then I'd make sure I could get far enough away from the outlet to pull it out. And Michaela particularly, I remember this one year. She's in driver's training now, but Pastor, I'll go plug that back in for you. I said, no, let's all go over by the cord. And I took the cord and I said, okay, plug yourself back in now. Get back to the power. And she says, Pastor, that's dumb, or that's stupid, yeah. You're silly. I remember she would say more than once. But that was the point, to come up with illustrations of either I'm smashed and I need to be fixed, or I'm unplugged and I need to be replugged in, or something like that. The relationship that Adam and Eve had with God, they pull away from it. And so the trees in the garden were not intended by God to trip them up on purpose or to show them they were stupid. By the way, do I have the mic on?
You do not.
I do. Sure I do. I forgot that. Well, anyway. So they pulled away from God. And everything after that, from God looking for them in the garden in the cool of the day on, is God saying, here's who I am. My righteous behavior is I look for the lost, and I go rescue them. I go bring them back to the relationship that I once had. So so the Bible really is God's side of the story of what does He do with the brokenness of people on earth. One other thing I remembered that I didn't say last week, it says that the woman will have pain in childbearing. The same word in Hebrew, atzeva, is the word that's used for painful toil with all your crops. Inside the garden, everything would stay in its own place. Outside, you've got thorns and thistles and weeds and all that kind of stuff. And they get tossed out. God says, okay, you're going to be in a world that's not everything the way I made it. The same word is used in the flood story about God who was pained at what human beings did on this earth. The same atzeva. Because he knows good and evil. He knows what goes against the way he made things. And it brings him deep anguish. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Another thing that I forgot to ask you about earlier, or to mention, there is a fight even about the very first words of the Bible and how you translate them. Right? And there are all sorts of people. You would not believe, and I'm not going to share with you, all of the different ideas of what different theories are about how all of this comes to be. We'll talk about a little bit of it with Moses and others later in our course, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But the first word in Hebrew is Bereshit. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God. Now, the beit, the very first letter in Hebrew, is the B is a word that's used for when. And so probably a better translation, and it is in the New Revised Standard Version that I pulled out of the trunk of the car for today. When God began to create or give shape. Now, yatsar or yetzer in chapter 2 is the word for shaping and molding with clay and things like that. Here the word bara is to give something its own, its workability. So what we're having here is really much more, how does God make us a place to live? To be in a relationship with us. And so there are people who said we have to translate it, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, because they said in that sentence we can say he must have created darkness, he must have created the waters, which neither of which are mentioned, and maybe even he created the angels then. Because we have nothing about the angelic beings here yet. It takes the book of Revelation before it says there was a revolt in God's presence, where the unseen creatures, some of them said, we're going to revolt against you and we're going to leave. And so Satan is cast out, and all the devil and all his angels. And we'll probably not do too much more with that. But as I taught the Old Testament particularly and the scriptures in general over the years, some little phrase kept bouncing out at me over and over and over again. Watch for it as you do the reading. I am with you. I will be with you. I will go with you here. I will go with you there. God is not like the Canaanite gods who are up in the heavens having all sorts of illicit kind of relations with one another. He is one who says, I am in a relationship with you, and it's going to be that way. The word Emmanuel means God is with us. Matthew 28, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The New Testament, when it talks about being in Christ, would be the same kind of a thing. And so God says, I am with you. And therefore, that's the thing that says, I never go anywhere without him. I never go anywhere. He says, go up to the heavens, go to the depths of the sea. There, I'm there with you as well. Now, we can't feel it. So we could say, well, I know God's with me, but it sure doesn't feel like it. As the water is rushing in to wash our house away or something like that. So it doesn't mean that no troubles come to us. That's kind of foolish to say to people, well, if you believe, then everything will go well with you all the time. Christians have troubles too. And we'll look at some of those things along the way. Nobody's ever been able to solve it, but it says, finally, there will be a restoration. So I alluded just a little bit to this as well the other day when I talked about things that are different after the fall. God created human beings to love people and use things. When Adam and Eve sinned, all of a sudden, Everything gets flipped upside down. The natural tendency of people is to love things and use people. Hey, Dad, would you like me to wash the car? What do you want? You know, and you can spread that as far as you want, you know. I'm gonna say no unless there's something I want to get out of it. And it takes Jesus' death and resurrection to put that together again the right way, to settle us so that our relationship with God, flowing out into our relationship with other people, is going to be primary. And that things are not what has to run the show or call the shots for us. That isn't how to determine who we are and what we are. So a variety of things that I thought about that I would talk about along the way, and I kind of didn't get to do all of them. The last thing I want to mention before we go into the texts, every bit of interpretation is guess land. The best we can do is have educated guesses. As soon as I say, this is what this text means, anything past just reading the text, and remember, people made guesses about how to even put it into other languages. What's the best word that we're going to use? So it's not like I can say, this is sure or this is certain, but this is the best interpretation I can come up with based on what I know of the ancient Near East or what I know of the Hebrew language or this or that or the other thing. There will be people who have all sorts of ideas of what they want to say and how they want to say it and what they want the Bible to say. Every heresy comes out of the Bible. It says, I'm going to take this text and I'm going to push this text to the ultimate, and then the other ones have to fit in around it. Kathy and I had great difference of opinion about some things when we were redoing our kitchen. And I said, I want to make sure that this kitchen is everything you want. But we had to prioritize. Okay, we have a radiator and 2 windows looking out back. We have a window and where the pipes are for a sink. So we had to say, okay, what's the most important thing? And if you're in a house that already exists and you don't get to design the whole thing, you have to say, okay, what are the priorities? But I'd like this here, and I can understand, well, it'd be nicer if the refrigerator was closer here, but then you're going to walk farther for some other things. And so the idea is, if I want people to be basically good, I can find texts in the Bible. You know, choose this day whom you will serve. I think there's a framework for that. But we have to say, what's our bottom line? So some people, the bottom line is James. Faith without works is dead. You got to tell people you do this, and you better keep on doing it, or else God's not going to like you. Others would say, well, Galatians or Romans says that we're saved by grace through faith, or Ephesians, not of ourselves, gift of God, that no one will boast. He then provides for us to do things. Somehow the Bible is a diamond and not a pearl. There's all sorts of different facets about our life, and we need to take them all into account and try and say, how does this all fit together? But everybody has a Bible within a Bible. I don't read Proverbs very much. Okay? I don't read Ecclesiastes very much. Every time I read Ecclesiastes, I'm never sure if the writer is a realist or a pessimist. Just never know. Depends on the day on how I'm reading it. And in trying to listen to the text, is it history? Or is it just religion and morality? Or is it about how I get to God? And there are 3 ways that I've generally talked about how to read the Bible. This is the last one before we get into the text. Is the Bible a blueprint or a roadmap or operating instructions? Is it a blueprint or a roadmap or operating instructions? You have to pick one. Sorry, Fred. If you are using a blueprint, what are you doing? Somebody has designed a bridge, let's say, and you are the engineer who is going to say, okay, what materials do we need for this? Where are we going to order? How are we going to build our bridge? Okay, so it's not done yet. Okay? It's still something that's going to be done. If the Bible is a blueprint, then primarily I'm going to interpret it as, how do I get to God? How do I get right with God? How do I build a bridge to God? Or what if it's a road map? Well, they used to say all roads lead to Rome. But the reality is, there are a lot of different ways I can get home from here. As long as I get home, doesn't matter, right? But are there a lot of ways to get to God? What do you call that? What's the outfit in just north of Chicago with the 9 doors? Yeah, there's a temple with 9 doors to it. What do they call that?
Is that the Baha'i? No.
Baha'i, exactly. Yeah, Baha'i. Where doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're sincere.
You believe something.
You have to believe. Everybody has to believe something. I remember Dear Abby one time. She wrote to somebody who said, the church seems too oppressive to me. She said, why don't you try Unitarian Universalism? You can believe anything you want there.
Yeah.
She did. That's what she said. You know, but the others would say, well, you could be Jewish, you could be Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, any way that you have just to live a good life here. So if it's this worldly, Paul says, if it's for this life only that we believe, we're of all people to be most pitied. How about if it's operating instructions? How does this human nature work? Now you've got to take, for us Lutherans, sorry Fred, for us as Lutherans, you got to say that means 2 things. It's really the same in the Catholic Church too. That I have an old nature that rebels against God and a new nature that wants to serve Him. So when I hear something, I have to figure out, is this something that leads me away from God or closer to Him? That I recognize His presence, or I want to run away and hide in the bushes. But a set of operating instructions is what most of us get when we buy our car. It's in the glove box. That doesn't tell me how to build an engine. It says, here's what kind of fuel you need to make it work well. And here's how the headlights work, and here's how the safety equipment and everything works. It says, here's what's already built. So the Bible is God's side of the story, not to say, here's how you climb up to me. But it's about, here's what I did to make everything perfect, very good, and here's what happened as they went away, and all of their descendants were born falling to their death. We are all born falling to eternal death. God says, I want to deliver you from that. Christ takes the fall instead and gives us, as I looked at that thing with the Spirit, the 7 stages of the Spirit last week, He gives us that relationship back so we can say now, unbelievers only have one way of thinking. We have 2. We can either recognize in the Scriptures that it says, here's what going away from God is all about, which, as Paul says in Romans, often when I hear about that, it gets pretty exciting. And here is what is drawing me to Him, something that brings me closer or lives in the relationship. I'm not going to let us have a big discussion about this right now, but I don't think I can ever get closer to God. If I read the Bible because I want to get close to God, I'm in trouble. Because once I'm baptized, I have been given deliverance from eternal death, and I am at peace with God forever and ever. My new life has begun. I can't get any closer. I can understand more about it. But in other words, I don't become more human when I'm grown up. That's really, people would say we shouldn't, or it's okay to have abortions. Wait a minute. The ability to be a human being is from the moment of conception, not just from the time when I can exist independently out of the womb. You bring a baby out of the womb, put the baby in a crib for 5 years. There's no independence to it. There's a dependence all the way through. And so the Christian faith says we never get beyond being dependent upon God and His mercy for us. And there are a lot of other people who are going to come from a different foundation, from a different framework, a different relationship. And if it's for this life only, go ahead with it. Live how you can. Be kind to your neighbor. Alita knows And Kathy knows a young lady who's a member at Emmaus whose father and mother are one's Hindu and one's Buddhist. They're from Nepal. They're wonderful people. Kindest hearts. You know, they've also heard a good bit about Christianity, but basically that's how they grew up, as Hindu and Buddhist. And so we can have people who on this earth are going to have all sorts of different ways in which they will live honorable, good, decent lives. All right? If it's just, I need to be honorable and decent, I don't know how many people have said to me, I don't need the Bible. I know how to be good. Says who? You know, if the very arrogance says, I'll tell God the way things are, nobody yet has been able to avoid dying on this planet, sooner or later. Even Jesus, who took our place. But as we see things falling apart, we see how God says, I'm not abandoning you. I have different ways in which I will deal with this. So let's get into these stories now. We've done with the creation story, having dominion and God resting on the seventh day, and then focusing in 2 and 3 on the specifics of the Garden of Eden, where they go away from God, and finally in chapter 3 God says, I will have to come after them. That's the nature of God in the whole Bible. When Jesus talks about the shepherd who looks for the lost sheep, there was an illustration some years ago in one of the Aid Association for Lutherans calendars, which someone had done a rather abstract picture of the shepherd, but you can see enough to know the shepherd is bruised and bleeding from going through all the thorns to go get that sheep back, and then putting it on his shoulders. It's not easy. If we think that God is dispassionate and that he can just sit back and look and say, I guess that didn't work, and that's the end of it. God is deeply involved in that creation. So as they are sent forth, you have, first of all, God makes everything good, but then the first thing is that there is sin. Adam and Eve pull away from God. They say, we're going to make it on our own. The consequence is they are out of the garden relationship immediately. Immediately. They're not out of the garden yet, but they're out of the relationship immediately, and God says, you get out of here. I have done some reading in the early Christian literature where people did a lot of musing about the life of Adam and Eve and many of these other early characters, and the struggles that they go through. They keep getting tempted time after time because the tempter keeps on getting them to think that something looks good, and then they fall even further. And so this idea that I'm not even smart enough to know what really that good is. But in addition to that, God gives them clothing, gives them skins, and then he says, I'll be with you even outside the garden, even out in that brokenness. So it's not like they're gone. Well, how much worse can it get? Well, the first 2 boys, by the way, you're going to ask this question sometime or another in your mind, who did they marry? Yeah. The Bible doesn't say. The Bible is not interested in telling us the history of everything. Roxanne asked me at the break last week about the dinosaurs. It's not talking about that. It's talking about God and human beings in their relationship. So a lot of stuff it just doesn't talk about. That's not its story. So if I came in here today and I wanted to tell you for the next hour about what Kathy and I did in Puerto Vallarta in January and February, you'd say, I didn't come for that. That's not the, I'm not paying my good money for that, my $500 a week. We come here because we're hearing certain things where God says, this is what you need to know about your heart and the heart of others and my heart. And thus, there's a lot of things we're not going to know, but God is gracious enough not to wipe them out immediately. Their eternal death started the moment that they see God as the enemy. The woman you gave me, the serpent you put here beguiled me. But in chapter 4, we have Cain being angry with his brother because his brother seems to have a better relationship with God than he does, and that his offering is accepted. And we have this thing about sin is crouching at the door. And you have to make sure that you have control or dominion over it. That doesn't mean that even sinners can't say, I shouldn't be doing this. I think that I had a chance a couple different times to teach in our prison system, ethics of all things, to the prisoners at Oak Park Heights and to the women out at Shakopee. And I said, I think I'd like to convince all of you guys to become evolutionists. Believe in the Big Bang Theory, not the one that's just about done, but the real big one. We don't know where it came from and how it started, but believe in the Big Bang Theory. Because that says we are all simply energy reduced to matter, and there is no morality. Just like there's no morality among the cats and the birds. Cat's going to get the bird if it can. The bird's going to pick up the rat if it can. You know, I mean, that's a kind of a natural thing. Humans are the only ones who are told, maybe we're going to be on a level where you don't do everything that comes into your mind. But here's Cain, in spite of the fact that God says, watch out, who says, I got to get him out of here. Yes, sir.
Are you comfortable with the idea that, like when Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, that God may be saying things that he's very confident people aren't capable of, but is naming an expectation for the purpose of showing them how broken things are?
Be in shalom with God as he's in shalom with you. Don't be saying I can get away with this because God's looking the other way. So let's take the word perfect. Maybe, I don't know if teleos is a very good translation of shalom. That'd be more irene, but be complete. All right, it says once we get married, we're one with our spouse. So I don't know about you, but I found out that that's a good time not to be dating anymore. I go home and say, Kathy, I had a great date last week. At one time, that was okay. Now, it's not. And so, you know, again, you get into the big fight in the study of Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Is this moral teaching, or does this say, I can't? And so I think what Jesus is doing, and the general Lutheran understanding of it, is this is not the greatest moral teaching ever. It says, on my own, I can't do that. And so it's the most crushing law. You know, you be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. In Christ, it's a whole different deal. He says, he's made me that way. I get to respond to and live out what is there now. We don't have that in the Old Testament yet. I think the Old Testament, God says, just don't act on it. In the New Testament, he says, I'm going to go deeper than this. You've heard it said of old, I say unto you. So my old nature is crushed by that. My new nature says, if he says I can do it, then God help me to do that.
So he was telling Cain to do something that Cain could do.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to go kill your neighbor. You don't have to kick the kid in the head. I couldn't help it. Yeah, you could have. Right now, there are some things that, you know, if I'm pushed down the steps and somebody is in front of me and I knock them down, I might say I couldn't help it. But in the general sense, Cain is saying, I've got to become God and get rid of my problems. And my problem is my brother. Now, even the earth gets polluted with his blood. And his blood is crying out. His blood is crying out to me. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's shepherd? He's his own shepherd. I'm a farmer. He wants to be a shepherd, let him be his own shepherd. Do I need to be a shepherd for him? That's not the kind of life I live. You get that later. The Canaanites were farmers. The Israelites were shepherds. And what do the farmers want to do? Get rid of the shepherds. Because they're eating up our land. And some of these struggles go on, or the hunter versus the shepherd, which we'll see in the Jacob and Esau story. Some of these things that are never going to be solved. And in essence, some people have said, you can understand the history of the world by how people take care of their land and by fights about water. That those two things will cover an awful lot of what goes on this earth and how people relate to one another. I don't think, in the external realm, I think the Old Testament is serious when it says you don't have to act on these things. And so the don't let the sun go down your wrath usually would say, give it to me. Ask me to cure your heart so that you don't act on what may be an honest gripe. But there are a bunch of people who would say, well, again, God is just making something that Cain can't do. Why didn't he take his offering? The Bible doesn't say. So, we can get grumpy when we don't get enough answers. The point is there's something wrong in the human nature that looks around at others and says, I have to be king of the castle. Yes?
So is the conscience, human conscience, is that something that's God-given, or is that something that is learned?
That's a very interesting question. The Old Testament never uses the word conscience. Okay? And it's used, I think the word is synesis or something like that, I think is the word for conscience in Greek, which is something about seeing things the way they are, so the way they are meant to be. You can have a conscience in any world religion. Okay, it's not uniquely Christian, but not every person buys into the same notion of, quote, right and wrong. Everybody has some idea of right and wrong. I think that the perfect example for me of a conscience is the ISIS terrorists who put on a mask when they lop somebody's head off. They know not everybody likes this. Why not take the mask off and say, hey, look, watch what I'm doing. The guy in the tank who ran some people over in Venezuela yesterday, he's hidden in the tank. Can't see him face to face. We're hidden. We're behind the masks. Confession is taking the mask off and saying, this is what I really am before you, God. But conscience needs to be informed, and we would say our conscience is informed, using our own language, by what God says we are. I know I'm not supposed to hate him, but.
Right. So we really know.
There is a sense in which, and I think that's what Romans 1 says when God gave them up to their passions and lusts. They knew this, but then they acted this way instead. They went off in this direction. I don't think anybody exists without having some idea of right and wrong. It may be their own definition.
Right. But if God created good, did he create evil, or is evil just the absence of good?
Well, let's see. We got 17, 18 minutes. I knew that would come somewhere. This is as good a time as any.
Sorry. This is good. What's coming is good.
Oh, yay. Does evil exist?
Does it exist yet?
How many of you think evil exists? I don't. I don't think evil exists. Now, here's how I can say it. This is trick answer, maybe. Not a trick question. Does red exist?
Yes.
Does it?
Well,
Does red exist? Does orange exist? Does pink-red exist? Does it? Does it exist?
well,
Is it something you can hold on to?
no,
Why not?
because it's not a thing. It's
Aha, as they would say. It's not a thing, it's an attribute. right? So, what we're told is that all of the light coming in is absorbed except this red color, which is reflected back. So actually, all the colors from the light here are hitting this, but red is the only one that gets bounced back. Now, does a vacuum exist? And I don't mean Hoover. Does a vacuum exist? A perfect vacuum?
No.
What is it?
The absence.
Yeah, it's the absence of something. So, we can use the word good and evil, but we should take them as adjectives and not as nouns.
But isn't that like Taoism then, that where the whole is?
It would be,
created by space, or-
it would be if there wasn't a God. Okay, Taoism is going to talk about the yin and the yang. Okay, there is half of this and half of that, white and black with the little dot, either black and the white or white and the black. That is what in philosophical terms we would call dualism, which says there's some good powers and there's some bad powers. And history is about them fighting each other. Is Satan evil personified, or I would rather say his actions of rebelling against God and tempting us are against the way God built it to be? So evil for us is what is not what God built. Good is the way he made it. This is good, good, good. This is very good. This is a very deep question, a very good question to ask, because it says God is in charge of the whole deal. And I've got an illustration. I'm not going to use it now, but before the end of this course, try and remind me to talk about the triangle. You might. Do you know the triangle with the circle and the triangle inside?
Yeah.
Try and remind me to talk about that, because within God's creation, there are things that are what he built it to be and against what he built it to be. That's what we would call good or evil. All right? And so as an adjective, and that's why I use the idea, a vacuum doesn't exist, it's the absence of something. Evil is the absence of the way God made it to be and to function. And so if we say, well, God is the source of evil, well, he's the source of creation, and it is possible that things go against what he made or they're consistent with it. But as soon as I say it exists, then I say God's the best good power and Satan's the best evil power.
So it's not an entity.
It's not an entity. It's not something you can hold on to. It's a word we use to describe something that's not the way it's intended to be.
Okay.
Okay?
So evil's an adjective.
Evil is an adjective. Good is an adjective. Red is an adjective. Green is an adjective. Okay? So I laugh and I say to people, I wish I had invested in the color orange when I was young, because of all of the cones and everything. Well, I could have never invested in the color orange. That's not something you can buy. I mean, you could buy orange paint, but you can't buy the color orange. I mean, it doesn't really, exist in that sense. I'll throw this out at you. What exists is part of the creation. And so in some strange sense, God is above and beyond that. You talked about that, I think, in church or in Bible class last Sunday. God is above and beyond the creation. And so in that sense, we don't even quite correctly say God exists. He is above and beyond all of that. So we say, well, where'd God come from? We're thinking in terms of something that wasn't and now is. And that gets pretty hairy. But let's leave it with the notion that God created the entire universe to work well. And it doesn't. And so evil is everything that's against what he built it to be. So when he comes and saves and redeems us, he says, now you are mine once again, and because my Son has given you the benefits of his death and resurrection, and the Spirit has delivered that to make peace with God the Father, we are now living that out. That's what our pastor says every Sunday in church. We are living out that new life. That's gospel teaching. If we don't hear that, then we're just hearing morality. So I sure don't want to come to church and have someone talk to me about greed or about selfishness or loneliness or things. Talk to me about what God has done. Because the other ones are all things, you're kind of greedy, why don't you stop it? You're kind of lonely, why don't you get some friends? You're this, why don't you change? And so the gospel should say, this is what we are already and what we get to live out. And here's what we are in our old nature and need to reject or go away from. So some wonderful ideas from people are on the level of Norman Vincent Peale. And they're on the level of, what's that lady whose cards I find trouble reading? They're-
Oh,
Joyce Meyer?
No.
Steiner.
Helen Steiner Rice.
Yeah.
Which are all kind of sappy,
Oh, go ahead.
kind of things of, well, there's a good days and bad days, and they don't give you any gospel. They don't tell you any good news. And so, this is the good news. It comes against a framework where there's a lot of bad stuff there. Sometimes God's mercy in dealing with the bad ones means the good ones take it in the ear. And that's where laments come in the Old Testament Psalms. Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? Yes?
And just because, as you said, the universe is not working well, it's not because of anything that God did at all. It's because they pulled away
Well,
from Him.
at
He
most you could-
created imperfection.
At the most you could say, he built it so that we're not robots, that we could stay or leave.
Exactly.
Now, I could stay or leave from 2503 Ferris when I was a kid. I could go run away from my parents, but I couldn't choose them. All right, so we're created, we live in a creation that God has made. If I say, well, I want to go to the moon, I still can never escape gravity. One way or another, gravity is throughout the whole universe. I can't escape that. And so there are things where people say, well, I can do what I want with my body. Yes, but that body is not something you created. And so there is a way in which you need to come before the presence of the God who made it all, who said, this is how I made it for you.
So God created everything out of a void. Then the good part, the void is what's the opposite of.
Yeah, the void or the chaos, as many people talk about, is the emptiness. He says, I make it orderly. When Adam and Eve sinned, they get thrown back out into the chaos of the weeds and all that kind of stuff. And he says, but I'll bring you back sometime. I have to do it, but I'll bring you back. The surprise is our Old Testament doesn't tell us all of that yet.
So the chaos was still there, and he created the goodness out of it.
The Genesis account seems to say there was muddy muck that God puts in order. That doesn't mean God didn't make that first. It just, in the telling of the story, it's much more, let me organize it for you. Let me give you a safe place to be, where you're not swept away by the chaos and everything. And that's there, human beings have a chance to wreck it or to take care of it. But no way can we ever work hard enough to fix it all. And see, that's the foolishness where people say, well, this terrible thing happened here, we're going to make sure it never happens again. Famous last words. You read about education in the 1850s. They said, we're going to make sure that education is better, and this is never going to happen again. We keep hearing the same thing. We're always going to hear it, because there's always something that's wrong. You can never get away from something being wrong, if nothing else than from your perspective. Cain didn't like it, and so he sins and he kills his brother. So he sins. He is forced to wander, but God puts a mark on his forehead and says, you are not to be killed by anybody. And so by then we're in a kind of a world where it sounds like there's farming going on and all sorts of other stuff going on. So the setting of it is a setting which describes much more of life than just 2 or 3 kids. So the next thing that we have in chapter 4 is this thing about Lamech boasting. And that one pretty much, I didn't ever think of this before, but how many people are supposed to die if someone kills Cain?
7 times over.
7. Okay. How many about Lamech?
I think that was 70.
He says 77 ought to die
Plus 6.
if I killed a man for just hurting me, 77 of my family ought to die. If somebody kills me, 77 of their family. What does Jesus say to Peter? Lord, should I forgive 7 times? He says, no, 70 times 7. And picks up this same thing. I got to play with that a little bit more, but I came across that recently. It's just, a 7 and a 77. Well, some other people say 70 times 7. There was a prof, a classmate of mine from senior college who taught at Augsburg. And he said that his daughter had a list. She was at about number 131 or something like that at the point. She was going to her 490, and then she could start really hating her brother. So Cain never says, I murdered my brother. He never confesses that, and yet God does not wipe him out. So sin, consequences, punishment is what we often say, and yet some grace. It happens that Seth is born. It says, now they call in the name of the Lord. Then in chapter 5, we get all these names of these people. We shouldn't be surprised that people are kind of bored with all this, but this really says there's a connectedness to all of this. And little bits that are dropped in here along the way that talk about how there is a connectedness that goes from the earliest human beings on down the list. So it starts with Adam and Eve in the likeness of God, and then here's where we get our idea original sin from our origin. We're in a broken relationship with God. And so it's not like God chooses some people to be saved and some people to be damned or sent to hell forever. Everybody's on their way to eternal death. He says, I want to call people away from that. He will not force anybody. But then at the very end, just really kind of drip drop, it says, oh, and he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It doesn't say he had Shem, and then after this he had other sons and daughters, but just real quickly, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, boop, boop, boop. And Abraham is going to be the same thing with his father and the kids. So we got this thing with Enoch at age 365. Everybody pretty much says that it must have something to do with the days of the year. You know how they figured out how long a year was? In Egypt, at least as one possibility, they noticed that one time a year, a stick in the ground didn't cast a shadow, where the sun was directly overhead and didn't cast a shadow. Or there might be a hole in the ground, a well, that the sun shone directly down and didn't shine on the sides, and a year later they saw it again. That's how they figured it out. And they got pretty close. 365 and a quarter is what we would say, plus a little nibble here and there. So anyway, we've got the hint about Noah, whose name Nuach means rest. If you know the word Menachem, like Menachem Begin, Menachem is a Hiphil participle for rest, someone who will bring some peace into the chaos and the brokenness. Because you see, the chaos came right back. It was the chaos of people on the planet. So the chaos is not just the ground against the people, but it's the people themselves are making chaos for others. When Kathy and I were in Egypt, or in Israel in '84, we went and looked at some of the archaeological digs. There was one city that had a 45-foot thick wall built up on the northern side of the city where it was flat land. Why would you build a 45-foot wall around a city? Cities are for two things: to protect your grain and to protect a water source. Somebody wants to get it, they're going to huff and puff and blow your house down if they can. Why would you build a 45-foot wall unless there was wickedness in the world and somebody wants what you have? That's why they build cities. That's why they put up walls around them, why they put walls up around houses, why we have gated communities for people, why we lock people up in prison to keep them inside if we can. Because we don't want to let everybody at everybody. To say nothing of whatever we do on our southern border. I don't know if any of you know, there's been some discussion about that recently, about what's going on.
I haven't heard.
Yeah, I'll fill you in some other time. Okay, so things are getting worse and worse and worse. The sons of God marry the daughters of men. Very difficult passage to understand. Some people talk about the children of Cain and the children of Seth. Some talk about good angels and evil angels and things like that, and, about the attraction of men to women. God says, my spirit is only going to remain 120 years. Guess what? Abram lived 175 years. I think Esau and Joseph both lived 137 or something like that. But by and large, you notice here the ages are dropping down. It's quicker. There was one before I think Adam, it says 130 years before he had children. And afterwards, I think there's somebody who at 65 has children. In fact, maybe it's Enoch. They had children and then lived 300 years after that. I'd have to look at the names. But anyway, part of chapter 5 and 10 say it's getting more to the norm. Some people think that there's a comment about 100 years as a generation. Others normally figure out 25 years. A lot of people would have died in their early 40s. You don't live very long in those days when you have a lot of troubles that come along the way. So God sees the wickedness as being great, the chaos, and he says, I'm going to stop it. And so what do we get in Sunday school? The arky, 2 by 2 and all that.
Oh, it's a nice song.
I know it's a nice song. I knew I could get her going. I knew I could get her going on that one. Yeah, but all but 8 people and a few animals are wiped out. This is the worst vacuuming, cleaning, scrubbing, where God says everything's gotten so filthy, I'm going to stop it all. Now, it doesn't concentrate on that a lot, but it says all other flesh died. I'm going to blot out the wicked. Now, what do? I've spoiled this story for so many people. I have a student who says, I went home and told my mother about why are we celebrating the Noah and the ark so much and all of that when almost all these people died. Well, I never thought of that. Of course, I duck low when I see him and his mother around anywhere. I don't want her to get mad at me. But you see, in the story, sure, it's wonderful that God is saving, and Kathy used to do the Noah story instead of Halloween, dress up as animals, and so, as an alternative for that. But there is a terrible sadness in here. And so he's told to build the ark. All flesh, animal, and human are going to die, and keep a few of the animals. I'm not going to get into this too much, but many, many of these stories you will see sound like they have a couple of versions to them. Is it just 2 by 2, or is it 7 of the clean and 2 of the unclean? And there are all sorts of ways in which we get kind of from different angles on this. We're not going to solve it. Is it 40 days or is it 150 days that we have rain? Is it 40 that it rains and then stays for 150? One way or another, human beings are virtually all wiped out. God says, I got to stop this. So the sin is their wickedness, maybe connected with the first verses, maybe not. The consequence of that is the flood that comes. The grace of God is Noah. That God says, I will save some. So we really are all descendants of Noah and Mrs. Noah. Most of us, I would think probably all of us, through Japheth, who's the one who goes up into the European area. There is some confusion in the text about whether Ham is the problem or his son Canaan, and whether Canaan is from the Semites, the Shemites, or from the Hamites, and again, part of the deal here. But it says that everything was done, and God says, no, I'm going to stop this. I'll never do this again. We'll see something similar with Sodom and Gomorrah, where God punishes a particular group, has the consequences of their rebellion come back on their own head. Okay, this is the old boomerang theory of justice. What you sow, you reap. The only question is when. And so sometimes we want God to zap somebody sooner. When it's us, we want him to be patient. So, we can play that game both ways. Remember, as I mentioned the other day, this is like the creation in reverse. The fountains of the deep started spouting upwards, sort of like if you see a fire hydrant opened up and the water coming out, and the waters from up above coming down through the sluice gates and all of that. And nothing, so the ark is really a temporary Garden of Eden outside the Garden of Eden. Okay, but it's God protecting everybody. We can't speculate about all the details of it, but it says that Noah comes and offers a thank offering from the animals, and then, so chapter 9, this is really a whole bunch of story. You get 4 chapters on all of this thing, of how do things go from there. You can eat animals now, but you are not to eat the blood in which is the life. They knew if you stab somebody, that the blood drains out of them and they die. So for many, many centuries, that was the whole concept of how things work. But whoever takes life away, their life can be taken away. And it would have happened soon. It wouldn't have been after 10 years or 12 years in prison. Some of the guys at Oak Park Heights told me, this is 15, 20 years ago now that I was there, but they said, a guy is willing to do something if he only gets a 7 or 8 year stretch. It's about 15 years before he says, I really don't want to come back here. So if you get a 15-year stretch, then maybe you don't want to go back. Heck, I hate so-and-so so much, I'm willing to be here for a while. One of my students told me, Dennis was his name, he said, I want to get a degree, and he was the one who got the doctorate, the college degree. They had me back to be a speaker. They liked me enough, they let me come back, even though I didn't tell them until the last week that I was a preacher. And because I said, I want you to think of all the other ethical systems that are all a bunch of hooey. And one guy said, gee, I wish you'd have told us that. We thought you believed in all that stuff. I said, I don't believe in any of it. But Dennis said, I want to die outside prison. That was his goal. Huh?
But what does that mean? There's
It
so
means-
different kinds of prison.
Yeah, and the truth is we're all in prison on this
Yeah.
earth.
Yeah,
And none of us are going to die outside of prison. We just get to walk around a little farther.
yeah.
Okay? We're all caught in something, and yet the Lord says, I'm going to create again that which I made. So once you get here, then God says, I'm never, and this is the first covenant, the Noah covenant, Noachic covenant that they talk about, that I'm never going to wreck the whole earth with this anymore. When you see the bow in the sky, you can remember that. So that's with all human beings. That's the first of the covenant relationships. Canaan and his father Ham, who's the one supposedly who sees dad drunk, and mocks and laughs about it. The other 2 brothers, they take a sheet or something and cover their dad up. All sorts of stuff about this as well. But it says that there is also brokenness and mockery that goes on. Chapter 10, now we get the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth and the directions they go. This is called the Table of Nations. So Canaan lives in the land of Israel, in that area. Part of this is to explain why did the Israelites go against the Canaanites, the Girgashites and the Hivites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Termites and all the rest of them. It's cheap, it's easy, it's all I've got. So, but you might notice that it says that they went all different directions, and yet the next chapter, so we've got stories that were probably told independently, and as they're drawn together, this part of the story gets put here. So now all of a sudden in chapter 11, with the Tower of Babel, we're told there's one language and few words. Okay, as God chased Adam and Eve out of the garden, so now people are going to be chased everywhere. They're not going to all be together in cahoots. You notice that Adam and Eve aren't in cahoots right after the fall, and they're going to be at odds with the created order, the grass, and they're going to be in the created, or in disorder with Satan and the powers of evil. There's going to be conflict now. It's not going to be peace that they will have. But here again, God confuses the language. Bab-Elu, the word for Babel or Babel, Babylon in Akkadian, means the doorway or the entrance up to God. And they had their ziggurat, their building that they built, the tower that they built. And this is really funny. I won't do it because I'm getting filmed here right now. But in class, this is the classic thing. And we get a couple times in the creation story in here, let us, which is God thinking out loud. And sometimes God does that. He just says, I think out loud. And we hear soliloquies sometimes about what God says and thinks in his own mind, that who's he talking to? You know, but he says, let's go down and see this. And all I can think of is, honey, we shrunk the kid, or I shrunk the kids. And, you know, so here's this big tower that goes all the way up into the heavens. God says, where in the world is that little thing? Oh, there's that little speck over there. Oh, there it is. And so he goes down in mockery and says, you think you built something big? Got the whole universe here that I built. Who do you think you are anyway? But then he scatters them and says, you're going to be off by yourself. At the very end then, we have the story of Abram. That's where we're going to take a break, and then we're going to get on and be able to do a little more just technical text with chapter 12 now after the break. So, yes?
Last week I asked you who wrote the Genesis, and you said I had to wait till today to find out.
I'm going to wait for a while yet. Okay? I'm going to wait until farther into it. Okay? There are some who say that it is all done by Moses and that God gave him all the words. There are many, many other theories because of differences in the way words are used and phrases and which word for God is used. Some think, the minimum is, some think that there were some documents that got put together later, and that stuff goes back to Moses, but not necessarily the words that we have. Others say just many, many traditions, which show up in documents, etc., are drawn together. So it's a very big fight. It's something that gets involved with people saying, well, if God inspired everything, why are you calling it into question? And why can't God give Moses all these stories? Some would say, well, the stories were passed down by hearing for many, many, many generations, and then they get put into writing, and they still might have been talked about verbally even after that. Just like I might write up a story of my family, that doesn't mean nobody ever talks about the story anymore. But it's more complicated than I can ever explain to you. And it makes my head spin sometimes to see all the different theories about how all of this came to be. I would rather say, here's how we have it, and here's what I think it's saying in general from different facets. You know, it's not a pearl where it's all going to fit smooth. But there are people who have kind of stood on their head trying to make it all smooth. And sometimes I think they've strained the story too much. But that's enough for now, okay? It's beyond what we're ever really going to know. There are lots of theories about how it all comes together. I think many more people are involved in bringing it to us than just a few well-known characters. But how all that takes place, I'd rather not get into a rational discussion or a linguistic discussion about something where so much of it is guess land. And I understand from various points of view what people are saying, but it gets very complicated very quickly. So, yeah. Okay, let's take a little break. The story changes now. Remember that what we had is sin, the consequence, and the way out. We saw it with Adam and Eve, with Cain and Abel, and with the flood. Now we don't have it. So God has worked with humanity in general, even with the thing with the flood. Now we get to the point of one person being chosen. Okay, one individual. So the sin is the Tower of Babel. Let's make a name for ourselves. The consequence is being scattered. And then the very end of 11 and on into 12, God says, I'm going to work through a particular individual to bring blessing to everybody. And that's Abraham. So everything from here on out, there are like three big chunks. You've got the story of prehistory, the story of Abraham and his family, and then later we're going to have the story of David and the kingship. Those will be the three major parts. In the books of Moses, we have two major parts. We have narrative, or history as sometimes people would call it, and law or instruction. Moses is really going to be much more involved with just instruction about things. That's where he will be giving a framework to what the people are going to do. But this, to me, is the most important actual 4 verses, not 3, in the entire Old Testament. Okay, I think everything hangs from this. Some people will talk about covenant at Mount Sinai, but I think this has a much different framework. And so, now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed," or some say shall bless themselves. And there's a discussion about the meaning of a particular Hebrew form there. But what does he do? How old is Abram at this point?
I don't think we know.
I think we do.
40, isn't he 40?
No.
I think it was 50 or 60 or
Keep going.
100?
Not 80.
100?
He'll get to be 100.
90 then.
He's 75. We get from a couple other places. He's 75, and his wife is old. She's 10 years younger. She's 65. The normal thing would happen is that when you would get married, the man would get married when he is old enough to have his own family and provide for them, which you don't generally get when you're 15 years old. You might when you're 25. Okay, if you only live in the early 40s, as many of them did, that would be a little different. So Abram's probably 75, his wife is 65. How long have they been married? Make a guess.
Well, they lived forever.
Huh?
Because they lived forever.
They didn't live forever. The numbers are coming down radically at this
Okay.
point. But if he's 75 and she's 65, how long do you think they've been married?
40 years?
Huh?
40?
I'm guessing 50. Okay? Because a girl would get married usually when she could start having babies.
15.
And even though that's a little bit delayed now versus what it apparently was, that it's gone maybe to 15 now and instead of maybe 11 or 12. They've been married 50 years. How many kids? None. Don't have any children. And so God says to him in Ur of the Chaldees, which, guess where that is? It's by the Ziggurat, down in Babylon area. Ur of the Chaldees is down the southern part of Iraq. He says, "Go from your country and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Go away from everybody you know. Go away from all support, and you're going to have to rely on me. I'll make of you a great nation. God makes a whole bunch of promises to him, doesn't he? What did Abraham do so that God chose him here in chapter 12?
He worshipped other gods really well.
He really was a good, he really worshiped other gods really well.
He did nothing.
I read Joshua 24 to a dear lady who was a teacher and one of the first Sunday school teachers where I was in Michigan. I read it 3 times. Abram served and his family served other gods. Why did God choose Abraham? Because he was a believer, because he was faithful. It just didn't matter to her. She knew the pious answer was because he was a believer. Well, we're going to find out he's a believer later. But God surrounds him with grace before he did anything. Now, whom does he worship? The guess is the moon god seen. Remember we talked last week about the moon as the god of the Mesopotamian region, Iraq, because of the thing with the floods and everything coming along. There are two major centers of worship of the moon god in the Mideast. Ur of the Chaldees and Haran up in Syria. Where do they move? From Ur to Haran. Move from one big place of worship to another one. All right? So, he was told, you're going to go into a land I'm going to show you. They stopped there for a while. That's where Uncle Laban is going to be. And so he goes to the land of Canaan. So the most important thing is chapter 12, verse 4. And Abram went. One of the first books that I ever did a book review on was one written by a guy who taught at Capital Lutheran University in Ohio, Ron Hals, H-A-L-S, probably one of the most helpful books that I ever read, titled Grace and Faith in the Old Testament. God's grace always precedes the response of faith. Okay? We're going to see it as well with the giving of the 10 words. God says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now here's how life goes inside the relationship. He doesn't say, if you're good, then I'll take you to another land. He says, I made that promise. Luther talked about God's promises help us to understand how to interpret the Bible. What did he promise us? And so what do we do when we pray? God, you told me that this is going to be the way it is. Better do it now. He says, I didn't promise you that. You know the old thing, God didn't promise you a rose garden. So I might pray to God with my own ideas about what I want from him. What are the promise? I'll be with you always. Doesn't promise us that we're going to get everything. But so here's Abram, and a lot goes with him and then peels off the next chapter. But the promise is, I will protect you when there is nobody else who's going to protect you. I'll make of you a great nation. So it says that Abram goes then to the land of Canaan. Now, the word Canaani is the word for merchants. If you look at the map of Israel, it is kind of like the confluence of 90 and 94 and 294 going around Chicago. Okay? You got this whole big bunch of land in Wisconsin and Illinois, some in northern Illinois. You want to get to Indiana, you want to get to Michigan, you got to go through that thing which on a Sunday night has every truck that has ever been made, as far as you can see in any direction and as wide as you can see in any direction. They're all sitting there moving about 3 inches an hour. And that, so to the west you've got the Mediterranean. To the east you've got the Saudi Arabian desert, the Jordanian desert. So if you want to go from Iraq to Israel without sending a Scud missile or something like that, but in the ancient world you'd have to go north along the Euphrates and then come down. And so you want to go down between the land of the Nile with all of the things that they would have imported and what you would get from the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. This is the land that goes through it. So the Canaanites are the merchants. They're the people who take care of all that stuff that goes through their land. In fact, God knows that, and he says, all those people are traveling through on the interstate. They're going to see you sit under your vine and fig tree and say, boy, they must have a great God. He's taking care of them. They don't have to be working hard 9 days a week. They can just relax and enjoy it. So he goes to Canaan, and he stops at various places along the way. I'm not going to read everything to you, but as he stops, he apparently goes to every one of the worship sites. And worship sites for the Canaanites, and says, someday we'll worship here. Someday we'll worship here. Through, I think, 4 that he does along the way. And then there's a famine. Now, is God a God of people or a God of place? It's not a trick question.
People.
People. You might remember Mrs. Trapp saying, come Lord Jesus in Cairo. I'm supposed to say, well, this is a Muslim territory, I can't talk to Jesus here? The whole earth is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. Abram thought, well, God promised me he'd be with me in Canaan. What happens in Egypt? Now, here's the overview of the story of Abraham. In chapters 12 and 20, in 2 different places, he lies about his wife being his sister. In 15, he suggests to God, I know it's been trouble for you. Sarah's not pregnant. How about if Eliezer, my servant, becomes my heir? Chapter 16, Sarah gives Hagar to him, and Abraham impregnates Hagar. 4 different times, Abram acts like, I got to make a decision. I've got to decide what I'm doing. And so what happens then? Finally, in chapter 22, God's going to say something different. And we're going to see, there's a phone going off. Somebody's got a phone somewhere.
Not mine.
Is it mine?
It's there. It's in front of you.
It was.
It was. That sounded far away. I'm sorry.
So Abram did not.
Another one of these calls where it says this is a crank call. Don't answer it. Yeah. Yes.
So
Somebody.
I said, so when Abram left, he wasn't going on faith. Was he going?
Yes, he was, and he wasn't.
Okay.
He goes on faith.
For what goes on faith, why?
He goes on faith because he trusts God.
Okay.
But then, when things aren't happening the way he wants, then he reverts to, I better be in charge and help God out a little bit.
Okay.
Sometimes, I'm going to throw some things out that people can bop me over the head for. Sometimes that's how I hear prayer chains.
I agree.
We got to gang up on God. So if everybody is praying, then everything will be okay. The prayer of a righteous person avails much. It's okay to say to God, this is something that is on our hearts, would you please take care of it? But we're going to tell him what to do. I had a lady one time whose father-in-law had a heart attack back when I was in Michigan. And I got a call 9:30, 9:40 at night on a Saturday night of all things. So-and-so's dad is in the hospital. I got there, and her sister-in-law, the man's daughter, says, if prayer works, Dad will get well because so many of us are praying. That Tuesday, I was at the funeral home. God doesn't play that game. So he's not under our authority. We don't tell God what to do. But that doesn't mean Abraham didn't try. Now, when did they figure out, I'll ask you now, before I forget it. When did they figure out it took a man and a woman to make a baby? When did they figure out it took a man and a woman to make a baby? I'm told about 400 years ago. Till then, they thought that the woman was the soil in which the seed grew. That her womb was the soil in which the seed grew, and the soil was the male. Can you see why women would have been seen as not worth much? Instead of that there's sperm and egg? They didn't figure it out until apparently they started doing cadavers, or autopsies on female cadavers. They began to, what's this stuff? And found out about the ovaries. Till then, they had a whole different concept. So, just think of the stupidity that we can have and how things get looked at. So, if Abraham can't get Sarah pregnant, well, and we'll touch on that again in a couple minutes.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, okay. Watch how quick I answer.
So if Abram is worshiping the moon god, how does he know the Lord?
The Lord comes to him. He interrupts him.
But how does he know who this is? We don't know that.
We have no idea. He
That's
moves
so
in his heart
interesting.
some way or another.
Yeah.
We don't even know what way
So interesting.
to move this guy to say, I'm going to
Do what he said.
follow what he says.
Yeah.
Do what he says, follow what he promises,
Yeah,
okay?
it's impressive, it's
Yeah.
incredible,
Yep,
yeah.
yeah. And at a point when you're getting old enough that you're going to be in the nursing home, and it would be nice to have some family come to take care of you. He's going to end up living another 100 years, but you can't know that. You know, nobody knows how long it's going to be that they're on this earth. So Abraham, anyway, they get into a drought, and Abram goes down to Egypt. Lies about his wife being his sister. Okay? And she's taken into Pharaoh's harem. And then all sorts of trouble happens, and the Pharaoh finally figures out, this is not your sister, this is your wife. Now, there were long kind of things that would happen. If you had a sister, her beauty may be in her wallet, or actually the jewelry on her neck. So somebody may say, hey, we can get a bunch of loot this way. That's how the people of Shechem with Dinah are going to do things. You know, we can get into these guys' pockets. Let's get circumcised and we'll join with them then. So anyway, finds out about it. Along the way, they pick up Hagar. Okay, because that's when they're down in Egypt, who's going to show up a little later in the game. And so he is forced then to leave Egypt. All right? The Pharaoh sends him off without too much trouble. Later, there's going to be problems where they want to keep the descendants of Abraham there. So chapter 13, God had said, you're going to be very wealthy. So now what happens? They get wealthy. And so Abram and Lot are so rich, they're green card people. They don't belong there. Okay, so they don't belong in the land, but apparently there's enough room. Don't think of this as going out in the Wild West and maybe a few Native Americans here and there. Things were developed way, way before this. The great Canaanite cities from the 1500s aren't quite there yet, but you've got a movement. In fact, the Amorites, the word, you probably heard the word Amorite somewhere, the Amuru were people from southern Iraq who were looking for farmland, etc., and grazing land. There was a whole big migration that went from southern Iraq. He's part of a whole big migration, maybe 2000, 1950 before Christ. So Abram is about as far before Christ as we are after. But this is not where there was nobody there. I mean, this is not like walking out of the Garden of Eden. Okay, lots of very developed land already. The pyramids are about 600 years old by this point. 600 years old. In fact, there was a Bible dictionary once that I refused to even look at to buy from a publishing company that showed the illustration of the Israelites building the pyramids. It was only off by 12 or 1300 years. I said, if they can't do any better than that, I wouldn't waste a nickel on their book. If they'd have given it to me free, I'd probably said no. Okay, so lots has been going on. We're in the late Old Kingdom, late Old Kingdom period. Might be in the first intermediate period. It's way back there in Egypt's history, which goes way back to before 3000. This is maybe 2000 or so. So there's lots going on. And people are moving here and there, and a lot of changes. So Abram and Lot are rich, and Abram says, well, now remember, that's part of the promise. You'll be well-to-do. He doesn't have any kids yet, but they got a lot of stuff. So he says to Lot, you go where you want to. Lot looks down at the plain down by the southern end of the Dead Sea and says, boy, that's nice and green down there. I think I'll go there. And we know about the wickedness of what goes on a little bit later. But God already, before Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, he gives them the chance to be touched by the grace of Lot. Now, they're not going to accept it. God says, I'll be gracious, and others can enjoy that as well. So, God had said to Abraham, the servants are fighting, and God said to Abraham, it's all going to be yours someday anyway. This is the big promise of the Old Testament, land, L-A-N-D. Okay? We don't hear about heaven. We don't hear, when you die, I'll take you to heaven with me. We hear about land, a place of protection outside the Garden of Eden, where God says, in essence, this will be the temporary Garden of Eden. Now, he doesn't use the word Eden here in the story at all. Nothing like that shows up. But God says, I'll protect you, and you're going to be gone down in Egypt, your descendants will be, and then they'll come back here, but this will be your land. And we'll talk more about it along the way of how we look at that today. But so Abram looks around, he sees it all, and he's told that all of this is going to be his. Well, there's problems, because there are two major highways. The King's Highway, which is east of the Dead Sea, and then there's a way along the sea. And along the highway to the east of the Dead Sea are Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. And it sounds like that, just like around Chicago by 294 and 90 and 94 and all that, that there were toll booths. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah would have been expected maybe to help put up the people at a caravanserai or something like that, but then to charge them for it. Just like in the Middle Ages, why do you have castles? You always have castles at a bend in the river. And they stop people going both ways and say, we'll protect you from here down a ways. You give me money, and we'll make sure that you don't get robbed. I'm sorry Dale's not here for this one, but when we go to Tiger ball games, pull in, they had all these just local lots where there used to be houses, and some kid walks up and said, give me $5 and I'll watch your hubcaps. Why didn't we take those things off and put them in the trunk? Never gave any money, never had them lost, but intimidation, we'll rip you off a little bit. And so for 12 years, apparently, in this operation, these people from southern Iraq, which is where Shinar and the rest of it is, the people from southern Iraq are getting their toll booth money. In the year 13, Sodom and Gomorrah people say, we think we'll just keep it for us. They quit sending the money in. Like the toll booth owner saying, yeah, the city of Chicago has enough money, we're going to keep it for us. Well, then the four kings come against the five and say, we're going to take you away. They haul everybody away. All right, a threat. Now, see, Lot's not even around Abram anymore. Is Abram very rich?
By that standard, yeah.
How do you know he's rich? How many people work for him as an army? How many people can he take in as an army? 318. 318 go with him to help rescue Lot and all the rest of them, along with some of the people from the Canaanites. They go and they rescue him. And so Abram finds out that Lot's been taken. He goes to get him, rescue him, bring him back. And he gets all the loot as well. Whose loot is it then? All of the money that was taken from Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, now belongs to Abraham and those other guys. On the way back, he stops in Salem, connected by virtually everybody with Jerusalem. And he meets a guy called Melchizedek. My king is righteousness. Melchizedek's called the priest king. He'll appear in Psalm 110, he'll appear in the book of Hebrews all over the place, as one who is greater even than Abraham's great-grandson Levi. And so it says there's somebody who worshiped God even greater than the Levites and the whole high priestly family, that Abraham, they thought that all of your descendants were in your loins. And that when you had sex, you passed all of your descendants on to the next generation. So book of Hebrews says, well, Abraham had Levi and all the rest of them in his body. And so they all worshiped down, or they all bowed down and worshipped. So Abram goes and he gets blessing. He leaves a tithe there. 10% of all the stuff that he has taken. And then the kings say, well, it's all yours. He says, no, nobody's going to say they got rich, that I got rich off of them. You take all of it back. The other guys who came with me, they can have their part, but you get whatever was taken, you get that back again. So these major kings are defeated. And again, not just chapter 13 with Lot being there, God was gracious to Sodom and Gomorrah. unlike what happens in 18 and 19 where he bombs them. But he had been gracious, and they turned around and acted as if that God was nothing. So you have to, I can remember the early years when I was teaching the Old Testament, I said, my goodness, there's a connection between this and this. We're usually just looking at one chapter at a time. Sometimes you have to say, hey, there's something here that repeats here and here and here, and this is kind of an unfolding. So God's saying, I'm going to be with you, I'll protect you, and everything will be fine. So Abram is blessed by Melchizedek, and so some would say that God himself, working through Melchizedek, lets Abram know, I'm here, I'm with you, and the thank you that goes with that, with the tithing and all. So Abram still doesn't have any kids. Hey God, you made a promise to me. We're getting older. She's not having periods anymore. What's going on? And so God appears again to Abram. Appears to him several times, makes promises several different times. All this will be your land, and you will have descendants. So Abram says, you know, God, you're having a lot of trouble with this one. I don't think Sarah's going to get pregnant. And so how about Eliezer of Damascus, who is somebody he would have picked up when they were coming from Haran on down to the land of Canaan. And God says, no, one of your own descendants is going to be your heir. All right. And so it says, Abram believes. This is the text that Paul picks up on. Abram believed, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. Almost like a righteous response to God being righteous and saying, I made a promise, I'm going to keep it. People today would say, well, God hasn't come back yet. It's been 2,000 years. Jesus hasn't shown up yet. I don't think it'll ever happen. Maybe we're part of the early church. Maybe 483,000 AD is when Jesus is going to come back. Maybe they're going to talk about us along with Augustine and Luther in the same breath. You never know. Most of the world's history may still be ahead of us. And a lot of people say, I hope not. It won't be for us. We only get a certain amount. But so anyway, it says that it was reckoned to him as righteousness, which is where many people would say the idea of faith comes from. Not only chapter 12, but here in chapter 15. Okay, if that's what you say. Unfortunately, the next chapter he's going to go just the opposite direction. Now, one of the things that apparently was practiced in this time period, way back in the 2000, the Middle Bronze Age stuff, is that people who were making an agreement, they would bind themselves to the agreement. They would chop some animals in half. The birds apparently were just too small to chop in half. They could have, but they put one on each side. We were talking about that a couple weeks ago, I think. But just put them on each side. And then a fiery pot comes through as Abram is in a tardema, radam, a really neat Hebrew word. Only other time I know that it's used is when God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam. But Abram sees this fire pot going through. Abram doesn't do anything. But you would go through and you would say, if I don't keep my promise, you can do this to me. So God is saying through this fiery pot that comes through, you can count on me to keep my promise to you. So he gets assured once again. We don't get many hints, but once in a while we get a hint from God about something or another. When I started as an interim pastor at Jehovah, over on Snelling and Thomas, I said the people in our neighborhood need to have a chance to hear the gospel. And so I think you were involved in distributing some of those. I know you distributed some of the booklet here. Did Greg print them for you too, I assume? I still think it's a great tool. I did the Portals of Prayer in April and May of '98. And so I got permission to print it as long as we didn't sell them for money. And we distributed about 4,000 copies around the neighborhood in and around where Kathy and I live by Hamlin University. We did it really mostly all in one weekend. Got people from all over the place to help us do that. I said, I want the gospel to go out from here. People don't go into churches. You need to bring the gospel to them. And I said, I don't know how we're going to pay for it. It was like $2,100. And so I said, I don't know how we're going to pay for it. Take it out of my first couple paychecks. I want this gospel to be told. And so it started with creation and ended with the Great Commission. So for each day, and all of the titles were passives: saved, redeemed, restored, one-word things of something done to you, because God does something to us. And so all the different aspects of that. I virtually never sat in the office at Jehovah. I was always at Concordia, and then Dawn would just call me up when she needed to. But I happened to be there one day. And one of the very first things that happened, 2 members of the congregation died the same day. I'd never had that happen before. One of them was Dell Trebold. And Dell had worked, her husband had died very young, and so she had been a widow for many years, and she worked in food services. And her family said Mom would have enjoyed serving the gospel in the neighborhood. So the $1,100 or so that was from her memorial, her daughter came in and said, we want that to go toward paying those booklets. I didn't know that money was coming. Didn't have any idea about that. 20 minutes later, while I'm still in the office, another fella, I'm not going to use his name, but another fella, a long-time member of the congregation, he came in and he said, well, you know, my body is too old to have done those distributions. You need any money to help pay for it? And he was told, and he said, well, I'll do the other 1,000. In 20 minutes, God says, I'll give you a little hint. I like what you're doing here. Okay? You don't get many hints like that. Okay? But in 20 minutes, he said, I'll give you a little nudge here. I am with you. Go ahead and do what you're doing. And we grew by 115 members in 4 years. Well, 40 died and 60 transferred out. Didn't look like much on paper, but the change in the congregation was a huge number. People who said, hey, the gospel's pretty good. And people said, well, how did it work to put the booklets out? I said, we got them out. Now, some people came and joined. Some of them are still there. Okay? But the idea is, the goal was to get them out. Not to say we have to see whether this financially works. And so to me, it's how do you take that risk? And what's the first thing when somebody says we don't have enough money in the church budget? Let's get rid of the offering envelopes for the people who don't give. As if saving that $125 is going to fix your budget. Or, you know, let's send out just a few fewer newsletters. Oh my, you don't want to go that route. Anyway, so God promises once again that everything will be okay, and then bingo, 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 the very next chapter after he's been told, you and your wife will have a child, Sarah gives Hagar. And Hagar gets pregnant. 2 different scenes, one now and one after Isaac is born. It's, nah, I got pregnant, you can't. And lays it on to Hagar, or to Sarah. Now, it's almost as if Sarah says, every time you try to drive in the garage, the door is closed. Every time you try and get me pregnant, the door is closed. God has shut up my womb. So take Hagar. Now, if you think that the man is the one with the seed and the woman is the receptacle in which it grows, then whether he gets Sarah pregnant or Hagar pregnant wouldn't make any difference. It's how does his seed grow. All right? Now, so it's irritating to us. It's against what we would think of. It's not the way we want things to be. We're going to see it with Jacob and Esau, or with Jacob and Leah and Rebecca, or Leah and Rachel and Zilpah and Bilhah. But normally they had monogamy, but once in a while, you know, if you had people who got killed in war, you know, then you would say, okay, well, we still need to try and have him get descendants. So the brother-in-law would often be the one who, if his brother didn't have any children, would then be obligated by the law of the brother-in-law to try and make children for his brother as well. But anyway, Hagar flees, and Sarah chases her away, and then she's told, go back, and here's Ishmael. So, Ishmael and Isaac are stepbrothers, half-brothers. We have a sibling rivalry that's been going on for 4,000 years. Don't expect it to end anytime soon. Because everybody remembers, and they, instead of saying, well, you need to study history so you don't repeat it, a lot of people study history and say, we're going to change it. We're going to undo it. We're going to go back to what it was. So the Native Americans could say, we want our land back. The African Americans could say, we want to have reparations for you having been involved in stealing us away from our country, et cetera, et cetera. And we simply kind of slough that off and say, well, no, we're not going to do that. They have a point. Okay, so we just kind of hide from it and just say that's not the way it's going to be. Chapter 17, Abram's now 99 years old. And he is told that he's going to be an ancestor of a multitude of nations. God now institutes circumcision as a mark of the covenant. If I were Abram, I'd have said, why didn't you tell me that 25 years ago? But here he's waiting all this time to be able to see his progeny. Sarai, now called Sarah, and Abram is now called Abraham. They both mean Big Daddy. And Sarai means princess, and Isaac means Laffy. So Big Daddy and Princess have Laffy. I did devotions once when I was over assisting at Bethlehem on the east side of St. Paul at a nursing home. It was that text. And so I read the text and I said, any of you ladies here 90 years old, and a few of them raised their hand, I said, how would they react here if they found out you were pregnant? That's exactly what good rousing laughter. That's what Isaac's name means. Kind of like almost a hee-haw, guffaw, wow. How in the world did that happen? But God says your wife is going to have a child. And the males are all circumcised, Ishmael and Abram himself and all the rest of them. Then we have an interruption here. Chapter 18, the Lord appears to Abram. So is it God? Is it Jesus before he became in the flesh? Is it an angelic being? If you know the answer and you can prove it to me, let me know. Because nobody quite knows on these things. But somehow God communicates with Abram that, first of all, Sarah is going to have a child this time next year. Then that Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be punished for their wickedness. And Abram then starts bartering, at least to save Lot. This is the chapter that we all get when we're at the very end of the Hebrew book and we are with the numbers. Okay, 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And so all these numbers along the way, that's a chapter they always use. And when he gets to 10, he says, well, there ought to be that many. How many were there?
4, 5 or less.
4, maybe. Mrs. Lot turns around, becomes a pillar of salt. The 2 daughters get their dad drunk and then get impregnated by him. Not sure Lot was doing that great a job when he got himself, or allowed himself to get drunk with his kids. But at least they had not turned away. The sons-in-law to be, they said, you're joking. Just as people would have joked to Noah about building that ark. But chapter 19 then, it says, when the other 2 came to Sodom, that the angels, in human form, we would assume, that the people there wanted to have sex with them. That's where the word sodomy comes from, of course. And Lot offers his daughters, which irritates us. But Mid-East culture says if you welcome someone into your home, you do everything, your life included, to protect them. That's why 25 million on Saddam Hussein's head didn't matter. Because there are people who would say there is no price high enough. I think this Abu Bakr, or whatever his name is, I think he's got 25 million on his head as well. People won't turn him in because they have a higher honor that they believe it's an honor and shame culture. Anyway, Lot and his family are pulled away, and then of course the fire and brimstone comes down. This is the lowest spot on earth, okay, in terms of all the water that flows in from the Jordan doesn't go out. Very, very salty. A lot of it's drying up now because they use most of the water before it goes in. One of the names for it is Lake Asphalt. And So, except for maybe the first 150 feet, there's no fish or anything in it. The Romans, Calero, I think is the name of it, a little city on the east side of the Dead Sea, they would be able to load all sorts of goods from Saudi Arabia onto boats because the boat wouldn't sink very much. It'd be pretty hard unless you put your face down to drown in the thing. Much saltier than the Great Salt Lake. But anyway, there are people who think that it's at the southern end, and there's been all sorts of things about that. Actually, people are complaining that that whole area now is coming apart geologically because the water isn't flowing in there anymore. But then we get to Abraham, and I'm going to just take this last little bit pretty quick here. He goes then to the south, moves to the Negev, which is the southern part of the area, and he lies once again about his wife being a sister to a guy named Abimelech. Remember Melchizedek, Melchi means my king, Abimelech, my dad's the king. Israel didn't have kings at that point, but here nobody's getting pregnant, and Abimelech says, what's going on? And then he finds out that God kept him from taking Sarah into the harem, which again may be more financial than anything, and there's all sorts of ideas, but that's one of them. And then Abimelech has to pay the fine. This is dirty, rotten stuff here. Abram gets rich off lying. I don't like that story. I think that's rotten and wrong. But anyway, it says, the first time the word prophet's used, Abraham is a prophet. He will pray to God so that you will all be healed. Chapter 21, Isaac is born to Sarah and Abraham. And the next 4 chapters are nothing but the story about the birthday party. No, they're not. You would think after all this waiting, you'd get this da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, and have the balloons and the whistles and the parade and everything. Nothing much is said. He's born, and Hagar and Ishmael are kicked away. And God says to Hagar, your son will become a great nation. Well, the father of the Arab peoples. Okay, so still known today. Don't know many Edomites, or Moabites, or Ammonites, but we know the Jewish people, and we know the Arab peoples. Now, don't confuse Muslim with Arab, okay? There are Palestinians, there are Arabs who are Christian, who are Muslim, and so those are 2 different things. You can have Muslims all around the world, and you can have Arabs who are not Muslim, so don't confuse those 2. But they are still around as a separate people, and we continue to see discussion about that every night on the news. At this point then, Abimelech shows up again, and there's talk about how they make peace about wells that they have there. Chapter 22 is where I'm going to begin next week. So I want to begin with God saying, okay, give me the kid back. I think it's a good place to start. I want more time than I have for that. So we'll finish Genesis next week. The story of Joseph, I'm not going to talk about a whole lot. I love reading it. It's a wonderful narrative. It's a wonderful story. I always wonder how it's going to turn out. I really do. They say that's a good story that you go back and read again. You still wonder how's it going to turn out. But anyway, we'll begin there, and we'll finish up pretty much of the story of Genesis next time. Thank you all very much.